all I'm going to say as an intro to this really is the thing that stood out to us in terms of research into recruitment in particular and its impact on modern slavery is how little data there is out there. So I know that Jax will talk about this, one of the frustrations of doing this bit of research, which was done voluntarily as well with no resources, is just how little data and research is out there. And we know from our development work that if you don't have the evidence, if you don't have the data, it's very hard to make change. So that to me is the most glaring and urgent issue around modern slavery, and particularly as it relates to recruitment. So Jacqueline Parisi, as some of you will know, worked in the CID team for a number of years and is our much loved colleague. And then she has gone on to become the CEO of the Assisi Foundation in Melbourne in Australia, working primarily with projects and programs to empower women in developing countries. So, but before that, Jax has a stellar career working in social enterprises, in strengthening organisations, particularly in Laos and Cambodia and Southeast Asia. And working also with organisations like the Mekong Club around issues of modern slavery, and a particular interest and passion and work in the area of women who come out of sex trafficking and the support that they need. So Jax has got very deep experience and commitment in this area of human trafficking in particular and modern slavery. So it's fantastic to have her do this bit of research for us, and now to give a little talk about it, and then we'll talk for a little while, and then Jax will open it up for questions. I'll take your questions and just share that. So we're actually in the same room, so very high tech here. Now I hand over to Jacqueline Parisi.
Kia ora. Hello everybody, it's really nice to be here today, and thank you for that lovely introduction, Josie. It's like coming home. I feel like I've come back to my family. It's so nice. So I'll just launch into this, but basically my organisation, which I founded a few years ago, was called the Impact Effect. And with the Impact Effect, I was working with it, and I also did some work with the Mekong Club. So that's where the connection comes in. So I think I'm going to share my screen if that's okay. Aaron, am I allowed to? Yeah, it looks like I'm allowed. Let's see. You can see my very messy desktop there. Hold on a second. Can everyone see that? Yeah, good. Emily said yes.
Yep, looks good. Thanks, Jax.
Great, thank you, Aaron. Okay, so basically, this is just showing the connections then between CID, the Impact Effect, and the Mekong Club. And really this piece of research came out of those connections. And the Mekong Club, I've kind of worked as an advisor and a volunteer to the Mekong Club for quite a few years. And this opportunity to do the research came up. It's an area I'm passionate about. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be great to get CID involved as well, and made the connection. So really it's three entities working on one piece of research, which is always a challenge because across time zones and working with limited resources, etc., etc. But I think we did a good job. So basically I've got a few slides. What I'd like to do is take you on a journey of first providing a bit of a backdrop to modern slavery, although I know I'm speaking to the converted here and people who are passionate about this area. And so I won't need to go into too much detail about that. But secondly, talk about the role in modern slavery is a little different. Just give a high level overview of the research as well, if that's okay. So first of all, the first slide I'm showing at the moment is about the Mekong Club. So Mekong Club is an organization that's effectively based in Bangkok and Hong Kong. It works with the private sector to mitigate modern slavery. It works with a range of business sectors, probably about 45 members, And the type of work they do is training, advocacy, development of tools to help private sector or businesses work through these issues. So they're very focused in the modern slavery space, and in particular with businesses. So the statistics, this is, I find this quite alarming, actually. I always stumble a little bit when I come to this slide, because there's over 40 million people globally in slavery, which is more than at any other time in history. So actually, we're doing really badly right now. And 9.2 million newcomers enter slavery every year. Over 60% of those victims are found in Asia, and 16 million of them are found within the supply chain activity. 46 victims know their recruiters. So it's kind of feels to me like it should be easier to mitigate it than the jobs we're doing right now. So I actually have just a couple of case studies. I'm just going to read something while we look at this picture of a woman in a sweatshop in India. And it just gives you a bit of a flavor, so a bit of a story. When I was 16 years old, I heard that many spinning mills in a big city in my region offered work. My family was poor and I wanted to help, so I went there. I didn't know which one had work, so I just chose one. The man who managed the mill said I could have a job. We negotiated a salary of $50 a month. He said that I had to live at the factory site. There was no contract for me to sign, but for me, this was a huge amount of money, so I accepted and started work immediately. After working 18 hours a day for the first month, I went to the employer and asked for my first pay. He smiled and laughed before saying, "I'm sorry, I forgot to mention to you that it costs me $54 a month to keep you here, and I'm only paying you $50. So you owe me. Until you pay it back, you cannot leave this place." With armed security guards, barbed wire, and high walls, I couldn't escape. For 3 years, I was not able to leave. I could not contact my family. The more I worked, the more debt I owed. With so much work, with nothing in return, my heart was filled with hopelessness and despair. And really, that all came to an end when the factory caught fire and some authorities came in, and she was able to, it all came to light and she was able to return home. But that's just an example of a situation which is quite common. Another type of situation is the brick making industry, also in India. And there's it employs somewhere between 10 and 23 million people. And one reason we don't know the exact amount is because there's so much slavery in the industry, so there's a lack of records, but that's an estimation. So, and really, there's lots of recruitment, and the way people are paid in these places are key factors to perpetuating the cycle of slavery. For example, workers are paid as a family unit. There's minimum wages, withholding wages. Wages are settled at the end of season and they're not provided. And there's no proper records kept. So basically the brick making industry is just rife with slavery. And the third example I'm going to give is an example that is highlighted in the Greenpeace report, Forced Labour at Sea, the case of Indonesian migrant fishers. And in that report, so I recommend reading it. It's a really enlightening report. A 21-year-old worker is forced to work on a fishing boat. There's forced labour and trafficking survivors there detailing beatings and food deprivation, and tuna fishermen on vessels forced to work 20 to 22 hours per day for little or no pay. So they're the type of things that are going on. And of course, there's many other situations of slavery. And just to talk about the range of slavery, there's a few slides here, and I know I'm going through the slides at pace. The reason there's so much detail here is because I thought we could share them with CID and with the members afterwards, and you can keep them as a keepsake if you want to refer back to the information. But basically, modern slavery, the types of modern slavery or forms of modern slavery incorporate forced marriage, sexual exploitation, state-imposed forced labor, indentured child labor, and forced labor in private economies. And essentially, the forced labor in private economies, as we said earlier, there's over 16 million people affected by this. The majority of them are women. At least half of these are in debt bondage, and the types of industries they're in are agriculture, domestic work, manufacturing, construction, and several other sectors. So this research was predominantly focused on responsible recruitment practices of migrant workers to mitigate this last type of slavery. So really all the slides moving forward, when we're talking about slavery and we're talking about the research, we're talking predominantly about this area. But of course, there's recruitment practices in all of these types of slavery. So that sort of provides a good segue into the whole recruitment. And let's take a moment to understand the role recruitment actually plays in modern slavery. So typically recruiters target potential migrants from within their own communities or migrants along the migration corridors. And they influence the migrants' decisions by assisting them secure employment. When a recruiter does this with the intent to exploit, they're part of the trafficking system. It often results in migrant workers working for months and years without pay, and some recruiters are also the transporters as well. So it's all a little bit muddy, and their role in it, we know that they play a role, but who they are and how they do it is left to the imagination, really. But another criminal activity along the process is that once the migrants reach the location of work, owners and/or managers then might become exploiters, and then there's the enforcers as well who break in the migrants and maintain trafficking victims, and that, as we all know, often involves forms of brutality such as rape and torture. So it's not a pretty picture at all, and it's deeply saddening. So the purpose of this research, how did the topic come about? So responsible recruitment of migrant workers was the Mekong Club's yearly theme for 2020. And really they wanted to understand the recruitment situation in certain countries and enable businesses to make more informed decisions. So the research was intended, as I said, primarily for businesses with supply chains. And I should probably add that it's not intended to be an academic paper because that would turn off the businesses completely. So it was never meant to be an academic paper. The geographical scope, so originally the geographical scope was very wide. It included about 8 or 9 different migrant corridors. And as Josie said, as we started going through the literature review at the beginning of the research, we realized there was so little information that we had to narrow the scope in order to go a bit deeper rather than keep it broad. So based on the Mekong Club's wishes, the areas that were of most interest to them primarily was the India internal migration, migration corridors into Taiwan, and the Myanmar workers migrating into Thailand. So they're the 3 migration corridors we were looking at. And the methodology, so the methodology, basically the research question we were working on is, in what way can knowledge of the current recruitment practices and recruitment fees be leveraged to best mitigate modern day slavery? And we designed a framework and some parent disciplines around recruitment practices, impact of slavery, and the desired situation. And then we had sub-questions leading into those parent disciplines. And then the framework also comprised various methods of research, and they're listed there as well. So we kind of worked through that. The research was conducted, or is being conducted, in 2 phases. And this just shows you, so this shows you the scope of what I'm talking about right now. So the previous slide showed the different types of methods. We split the methodology into two phases, phase 1 and phase 2. That's not very creative, I know. But phase 1 is what CID and the impact effect did, and phase 2 has been handed over to the Mekong Club. So what CID and the impact effect did was we did the preliminary literature review, the desktop research, and a short survey to companies in the Mekong Club's network. And from that, the output is the interim report. And then for phase 2, the Mekong Club, we're hoping they'll take those results, do a deeper dive into key companies in the Mekong network, and interviews with other contacts such as ILO and IOM, people in the know. So that's kind of a really brief overview of the research. It is detailed in further detail in the paper. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it, but yeah, it's detailed there. And if anyone wants to replicate that methodology, I think it's in enough detail to do that. So the key literature findings, and this was interesting, as Josie said, there were so few findings. This is where we actually decided to narrow the scope to the 3 corridors. But essentially, key to say that migrant workers are extremely vulnerable to exploitation. They're charged excessive recruitment fees, provided with misleading information, and often their documents, their identification documents are withheld. And when this happens, they're often bonded to the employer and prevented from seeking alternative employment. A fair amount's been written about the links between recruitment and slavery, and also about best practice. And the literature focuses a lot about the necessity to be ethical. So there's a lot of talk about the necessity to be ethical. There's less talk about how to actually do that. So the desktop study and survey focus, as I said earlier, the 3 parent disciplines, the recruitment practices, the impact on slavery, and the desired situation. And we developed sub-questions to feed into that. And then what we did was the desktop study actually focused on answering these sub-questions, and the survey focus was designed to answer these questions as well. So the key desktop study findings in the India internal migration, so this is just in India, the key findings are really that the migrant workers frequently pay recruitment fees for placement in jobs. Internal migrants in India suffer, so little recognition by state authorities. So once a migrant moves from one state in India, they lose their entitlements and they lose recognition of their status. So, and in the same vein, India has instilled a lot of pro-poor entitlement policies, but often that's in state as well. So once you move out of state, you lose those entitlements. From a private sector practice perspective in India, many companies in the Mekong Club network, this is from the desktop study, it appears that many companies in the Mekong Club network have got knowledge of potential issues. They believe in total supply chain transparency. They demonstrate a commitment to disclosing their supply chains, and they show a socially responsible mandate within their companies. And again, practices seem to rely on the management of issues as they evolve rather than the proactive mitigation. So that's in India. And then the survey findings from India were that most respondents reported that they had little knowledge of recruitment fee practices in India. They weren't denying it, but they had little knowledge of the details of that. And workers are often hired from government authorized training centers. And the belief between the respondents was that that potentially mitigates the possibility of exploitation. From a personal perspective, I'm not so sure, but this is what the respondents believe. So I thought that was quite interesting. Also, I think this slide is interesting because for me, it shows, it indicates that even these companies in the Mekong Club network, many of whom are more informed companies, they've still got little knowledge of the actual practices. And some of them believe that only the employer pays the recruiter, but in actual fact, the employer pays the recruiter, but also the migrant worker pays the recruiter as well. So for me, it just showed the gap in common understanding. So if we move on to Taiwan, the recruitment landscape in Taiwan is that work migrants into Taiwan lack protection and bargaining power. And again, there's a strong presence of corrupt broker agencies. So a few companies are trying very hard to understand the problem, and a prominent multinational administered a self-assessment tool to gather migrant data. Some companies demonstrate a recognition of importance of respecting human and workers' rights through all levels of the supply chain. There's quite commonly, there's an alignment with the UN SDGs, demonstrating a wish to achieve fairness. And there's some large well-known companies have shown a dedication to incorporating these into their own corporate framework. So I'm heartened by that. That's really good. So that's desktop study findings. And then the survey findings for corridors into Taiwan. So the local economy is reliant on foreign workforce. So there's a lot of jobs that that the Taiwanese will not do. So I guess it's similar to our agricultural situation here in Hawke's Bay in New Zealand. But anyway, it's a situation where a lot of migrant workers come in to do the work that the Taiwanese don't want to do. So the need for foreign work is increasing, but even so, the migrant workers are often left economically and socially in precarious situations. And the Taiwanese government seems to be unwilling or unable to enforce labor laws without a significant disruption to the economy. So it's easier just to let this go under the radar. For the corridors into Taiwan, the desktop study finding, that was, let me just have a look. Yeah, so that was the survey findings into Taiwan. And then if we move on to the Myanmar to Thailand, the third corridor, the recruitment landscape, and this is a corridor that's very dear to my heart because I spent so long in Bangkok and worked in Myanmar as well. And the migrations driven by cross-border trade and investment, differences in economic development, and obviously ethnic conflict and other conflict in Myanmar. And agencies often charge excessive recruitment fees, and it often ends in forced labor, too often. Many multinational companies have got production in Thailand and they use migrant workers for Myanmar, and they seek to demonstrate ethical supply chains with no threat of modern slavery. So that's the aspiration. The company's research showed in the desktop study showed a strong understanding of how recruitment practices can lead to slavery, but there's little information on how they'll enforce ethical recruitment fees and practices and how they'll proactively counteract modern slavery in supply chains. So it seems to be aspirationally, there's an understanding and the people want to do things, but it doesn't quite translate into action yet. In the survey findings for Myanmar to Thailand, basically respondents reported that a key weakness of doing direct recruitment is that workers were too difficult to find. However, agency recruitment, they understand that agency recruitment increases costs for both employers and workers. It also creates risk for the workers. And in Thailand, the fishing industry, which is, as we know, notorious for human trafficking and modern slavery, and migrant workers from Myanmar are often made to pay sub-agency fees within Myanmar before traveling to Thailand. So, and as was said before, the employer also pays the cost. So not a pretty picture, but before we actually move on to any sort of summary of conclusions, I feel it would be remiss of me not to actually point out the research limitations. So really the survey targeted company in the Mekong Club. And as I've said earlier in the presentation, these are relatively informed companies in modern slavery issues. So they're part of the Mekong Club network, and so they already are aware of this information. We got very few survey responses. It was extremely low, and part of that we attribute to the fact that there are legal challenges related to sharing of information, which causes concerns for private sector businesses to openly share this information. The second thing is that the engagement of responders was further challenged by COVID happening. And the third thing is, understandably, the Mekong Club preferred to retain primary contact with the companies in their network. So as researchers, we didn't have direct contact with the survey responders. And so we're kind of unable to influence the level of engagement directly. So that was just perhaps 3 reasons why the survey responses were so low. So with that, moving on to interim conclusions. So there's no doubt the application of recruitment fees absolutely exacerbates modern slavery. However, it's a very complex issue. So there's the issue of authentic visibility of supply chain practices, especially when they're overseas. So not only have we got the situation where you might have a business or a plant with supply chains who are overseas from them, but then also the labor, the workforce actually comes from somewhere that's overforced from the supply chain as well. So the authentic visibility is really, really challenging, as is some migrant workers. I mean, clearly with extreme levels of poverty, they're desperate and vulnerable to criminal activities. So you've got that whole vulnerability and the hope that maybe this is going to solve their problems. Then you've got the different laws in different countries, and you've got the fact that it's just really hard to monitor. So many private sector businesses are making an effort to develop policies to demonstrate awareness. However, there's the lack of activity to proactively mitigate the risk of the problems arising. So it's almost like we're happy to show that we understand this and we want to do something, but actually that doesn't always, my opinion, it doesn't always actually translate into action. We're hoping that the phase 1 results will be useful for implementing phase 2 of the research, and we feel it would be necessary for Mekong Club to engage their network further, but go beyond their network to get a true indication of those businesses who are less informed than the businesses within the Mekong network as well. And there's a need to dig deeper. So that's some interim conclusions from a general perspective. Survey perspective, as I've said several times, the survey response was very low. They're informed companies, and the surveying companies outside of the Mekong network would likely yield very different results. And from a literature perspective, there's a range of findings, but essentially it's really mixed and not conclusive at all. So the recommendations that we came up with was that Mekong Club to complete the phase 2 of the research and to expand the interviews beyond the survey respondents and even expand it beyond their own network. And then link phase 2 findings of the research with some great legal snapshot studies which have been performed for the Mekong Club as well and can be found on the Mekong Club's website. other possible recommendations, well, we kind of thought it might be interesting to actually look at what knowledge New Zealand businesses have of their own supply chains overseas and the recruitment practices that go into those supply chains. And maybe this is something that CID might want to work with their own private sector members, or that someone else would like to pick up. But we thought it'd be really interesting to actually look at it from a New Zealand perspective and see what our knowledge is of these recruitment practices that go on. So that's a really kind of a whiz through the research and the whole issue of slavery. I'd like to just say a quick thank you, first of all, to the Mekong Club for coming up with the research in the first place and giving us access to their wonderful network, to CID, which is extremely generous of CID to allow us to leverage your resources as well. In particular to Emily Wakelin, who is an intern to CID and did a great job. Laura Turner, also an intern, and Campbell Garrett, who we all know and love, was an employee of CID in past time. And also everyone here today for your interest in modern slavery. It's a really important issue, and I feel like New Zealand as a country is only just beginning to get some momentum around this. And I'm just so thrilled that you're all interested in meeting and talking about it. So with that, thank you very much, and I'm going to hand back to Josie.
Oh, thanks, Jax. That was pretty alarming set of statistics there. 40 million people in modern slavery today as we speak, and not particularly reducing. So we've got a few people on the call I know who've been involved with the modern slavery campaign for legislation, modern slavery legislation. Does anybody want to ask some questions or make some comments on that, or the link between the potential legislation campaign and this research? So any questions, please turn your mic on or put it in the chat room. It'd be great to hear from you. Well, maybe I'll get it started. Jax, I mean, I know you haven't directly been involved with the campaign for legislation, but you know, how do you get businesses to feel that they need to stand up and talk about the fact that their supply chains don't have modern slavery, as much as they talk about saying we don't invest in oil and gas, or we're sustainable? How do we create that pressure on businesses to feel that they need to?
It's a really good question.
Yeah,
thanks, Josie. Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think we're only just beginning the journey, really. I think it's because it's about a supply chain, so it's actually not about the businesses themselves, it's about their supply chain, and because often it's about the supply chain into the supply chain, it's kind of, it almost seems 2 steps removed. So it's very easy to hide behind it. And I think the way to do it is not necessarily through advocacy and shaking cages and making a lot of noise. I think it's actually to engage the businesses and actually ask them, what do you know about your recruitment practices of your supply chains? And let them come up with the realization that actually we don't know enough, and that there needs to be more focus in that area. So I'm for let's bring everyone along approach rather than let's shame people approach. I think this has been going on for years and years and years, but it's got to change, Josie, because it's just, I mean, for over 40 million is too many.
Yeah. I have actually, I mean, I do think that there's a lot more willingness for businesses to engage in this discussion, and the pressure on supply chains, we've seen it during COVID with Air New Zealand and so on. So, I do think now's the time, isn't it, to really, we can do something with New Zealand businesses. We don't have legislation and other countries do, Australia, the UK and so on. Any comments or questions, please do turn your mic on. Some people here with some really great experiences themselves. who've worked in worked in this area in some capacity or other?
Everyone's shy.
Everyone's shy.
Nothing in the chat.
No thoughts or feedback? It's another question, listening to you, Jax, is there an agreed definition of modern slavery? Like you mentioned, forced marriage, indentured labour, indentured child labour, forced labour. In that 40 million, is there an agreed definition?
I think the research that Mekong Club has done and is on their website is pretty good. There's several different types of definitions of modern slavery, and some definitions choose to focus on a couple of those categories. But I like the Mekong Club's definition because it encompasses all of those areas. And I think in a topic like modern slavery, it's really important to look at it in its breadth, because for example, the role of recruitment, whilst it impacts the private sector and their supply chains, there's also recruitment roles in forced marriage or in other areas. So I think it's really, I think if I was looking for a definition, I'd go to the Mekong Club's website and actually look at how they define it. Yeah.
Any other final thoughts before we let Jax go?
Oh, this one.
Oh, Teresa, thank you. Yeah, I'm wondering if this is from Teresa. I'm wondering if there'd be any potential to cross-reference which countries New Zealand hires foreign workers and the employment rights in those countries. I know law is often better than application, but it might be an opener. Yeah,
that's great.
That's really good. Yeah, really good point.
Yeah.
Thinking of the mindful money approach. Yeah, I mean, certainly in our own region in the Pacific, for example, slavery on fishing boats is a huge issue, and you know, depending on the flag of the ship, depends on the legal framework that applies. But then, you know, I know there's a lot of work around the fishing industry generally about how you use international law, let alone the law of countries flying the flag, about how you can address that. And part of it is understanding, first of all, the evidence to show where it's happening, right? Yeah. And then you can kind of work out what are the incentives that you can put in place to reduce it. Joyce asked a question. We have many people traveling through New Zealand for the fishing industry. Yeah. Have you questioned that industry?
Yeah, thank you, Joy. Good question. The research was more focused on the Mekong Club's network, so it had a more of an Asia focus, but I think that's a great piece of research that's waiting to happen, and I'd love to actually bring the research closer to home and focus it in this area. I think it's a really important piece of work that needs to be done, and really, I mean, the research just came about because of the Mekong Club's focus. So it is more Asia focused, but no, I think it's a great suggestion.
And Joy, it's something that should be and is, you know, quite a central part of our development lens in the Pacific. So I know Pacific Island Forum has a huge piece of work around fishing industry, and you know how it is that donors like New Zealand, you know, can help. How do our aid projects work alongside the legal efforts to reduce slavery on the fishing boats coming into the Pacific, let alone, you know, around New Zealand? Well, if there's no other questions or comments, we'll draw this to a close and thank Jax, not just for this talk, but for the research, you know, and we really struggle to get this sort of research you know, the data is, we know this in development all the time, it's so hard to get the data. but it's incredibly useful to hone in on one particular point, which i.e. recruitment, and try and understand where the incentives are, and therefore how a country like New Zealand might put pressure on businesses in particular to be far more aware of what the recruitment processes might be. And of course, the campaign for legislation, for modern slavery legislation continues with a lot of support across the political spectrum, needs to be followed up by action. So anyway, thanks everybody. Good to see some familiar faces, and there'll be a recording of this. We will share those slides with you with some really useful stats and data, and feel free to get in touch with Jax. She's now, of course, working in Melbourne. She's not physically in Melbourne because we're in the same room. You know, but this continues, I know, to be a lifelong interest and passion for her and her work and career. So get in touch with Jax, either through us, or we can share her contact details with you. So thanks everybody, and have a good day. Stay warm, it's pretty cold, and we'll catch you for the next talk soon.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.